You know, usually when you go to watch a basketball game, you aren't paying for a ticket to just sit there and obsess over the lines painted on the hardwood.
Oh, definitely not.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't stare at the referee for 2 hours just to admire how strictly they enforce the out-of-bounds rule or, like, the 24-second shot clock.
No, you are there to watch the players. You want the action, the athleticism, the sheer human element of the sport.
Yeah, exactly.
You're really there to see the absolute limits of physical capability.
Right. You're sitting there waiting for that totally unexpected slam dunk or that brilliant physics-defying behind-the-back pass that just completely breaks the defense and leaves the entire crowd screaming.
Absolutely.
But here's the thing, and this is exactly what we are exploring in our deep dive today.
Yeah.
Those mind-blowing, unexpected plays, they only exist, and they actually only matter because of those painted lines.
That's a really great way to frame it.
They matter because of the rules.
Yeah, it is the constraints that make the creativity visible in the first place. I mean, imagine if we just removed the rules entirely.
It would be chaos.
Right, if a player could just, drive a golf cart down the court, pick up the ball, and literally drop it into the hoop, a slam dunk wouldn't be impressive at all.
No, it would be totally mundane.
Exactly. The brilliance, the absolute thrill of the game, lies in how the two teams interact strictly within that established framework to produce something entirely unexpected. The rules aren't there to stop the fun. They are the canvas that makes the art possible.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking that exact same lens, that sports analogy, and we're applying it to the grand architecture of classical music.
It's going to be a fun one.
We are going on a mission to decode the secret structural language of music. Because for you listening at home, to really understand musical forms, you basically only need to focus on two distinct points.
Just two.
First, how composers use the established rules. And second, the unexpected structural details they hide inside those rules to completely catch you off guard.
Right.
We really want to figure out exactly how these musical geniuses use these rigid frameworks, not as heavy chains to bind them, but like as a playground.
A very complex playground.
Yeah, a playground designed specifically to let them introduce brilliant structural curveballs that basically trick your brain, manipulate your emotions, and, keep human beings listening for centuries.
It fundamentally changes how you experience sound. When you encounter a piece of music, identifying the form first allows you to appreciate how the composer created a totally new work of art within an established framework.
It's like seeing The Matrix.
It really is. You stop just letting the music wash over you as background noise, and you start actively asking questions.
Like what?
Like, were any conventions broken here? Or was the melody magnified or maybe restrained by the form? Why did my stomach just drop at that specific chord?
Oh man, I love that feeling.
But as with any game, before you can fully appreciate the wild slam dunks of music history, you have to understand the basic dribbling drills.
We got to start with the atomic building blocks.
Exactly. The absolute atomic building blocks of musical structure. We have to start extremely small. And the most basic structural idea, our musical atom, is called the motive.
A motive, which is, basically a very short musical idea. We are talking usually just 2 to 5 notes in length.
Yes.
Just a tiny fragment of sound.
Just a fragment. But the key to a motive isn't just its brevity, it's the intention behind it.
Okay, what do you mean by intention?
Well, the identifying feature of a motive is that this specific tiny musical idea is repeated. It is either repeated exactly or it is modified in some way later in the piece.
So it's not just a random blip.
No, it's a recognizable seed. And the identifying features of that seed can be melodic, meaning the actual pitches going up or down, or harmonic, or honestly even just rhythmic.
I feel like the most famous example in all of human history has to be the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
Oh, absolutely.
That legendary fate motive. Even if you have never intentionally listened to a classical symphony in your entire life, you know this atom.
Everyone knows it.
It is literally just 3 repeated short notes, followed by a longer note that drops down. Dun, 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 dun.
Right. It is universally recognizable. It's essentially etched into the collective human consciousness at this point.
Yeah.
But what Beethoven does with it, how he actually uses the rule of the motive, is where the architectural genius really comes in. He doesn't just play it once and move on.
Yeah, he hammers it.
He repeats it over and over, but at a variety of different transpositions.
Let's actually define transposition for a second, because I want to make sure I'm picturing this right for everyone listening.
Sure. Transposition just means shifting all the pitches equally up or down.
Okay.
Think of it like taking a physical shape, like a stencil, and moving it to a completely different part of a canvas.
Right.
The shape remains exactly the same, but its location changes. In music, you hear that exact same relationship of notes, that same short, long rhythm, but starting on different steps of the musical staircase.
So it might start really high and sound urgent, or start low and sound super ominous. But he doesn't just copy and paste it mechanically, right?
No.
Because if a song was just a guy hitting the exact same 4 notes on a piano for 40 minutes, we would not still be talking about it 200 years later.
That would be incredibly boring.
Right. So here is the unexpected structural detail that absolutely blew my mind when I started digging into this.
Let's hear it.
Right before the first big pause in that first movement of the Fifth Symphony, and this is a moment where the entire orchestra is just aggressively hammering this motive, Beethoven completely subverts your expectations.
He does.
He keeps the rhythmic rule of the motive, right? That driving short, long pattern. So your brain recognizes the rhythm and you feel safe. But then he completely changes the melodic idea. He drops the pitch sequence entirely and throws in a totally unexpected sequence of notes.
What's fascinating here is how that single microscopic choice balances the human ear's deeply conflicting psychological desires.
Conflicting how?
Well, on one hand, we crave familiarity. The rhythmic repetition provides that. It anchors us in the sound.
Right, we like knowing what's coming.
Exactly. But on the other hand, the human brain desperately needs variety. If we hear the exact same thing too many times, we just tune it out. It becomes literal background noise.
Like a fan running in the room.
Yes. By giving us the new melody wrapped tightly inside the familiar rhythm, Beethoven keeps the listener completely hooked without the listener ever actively realizing why.
He is basically playing with your subconscious.
He is. But Beethoven and other classical masters like Mozart didn't just scatter these motives around randomly like confetti.
No.
They built them into larger, highly logical, load-bearing structures.
Okay, let me unpack this, because this brings up an observation made by the famous 20th century composer Arnold Schoenberg.
A brilliant analytical mind.
Yeah. He spent his life analyzing how Beethoven and Mozart actually operated on the page, and he realized they weren't just writing pretty sounds. They were basically writing in a language.
A very structured language.
They were taking these tiny motives and building what Schoenberg called sentences, or in the original German, a Satz.
The musical sentence. Schoenberg noticed a very specific, rigid structural form that these classical composers relied on incredibly heavily.
And it's math, right?
It operates almost identically to a mathematical formula. The composer writes a one-measure motive. We can just label that original idea A.
Okay, got my A block.
Then in the very next measure, they transpose that motive up or down by a specific interval. They follow the rule. We label that modified repetition A prime.
A prime.
Finally, that is followed by 2 additional measures of a completely new or related musical idea to complete the thought, which we label B.
So the literal blueprint is just A prime, B.
That's the structural rule.
One measure of an idea, one measure of that exact idea shifted slightly, and then 2 measures of something new to round it out and bring it to a close.
And you can see this mathematically precise structure everywhere once you actually train your ear to listen for it.
Yeah, wild.
The opening theme to Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11 in A major is just a pristine example of this sentence form.
Break that one down for us.
Sure. The opening measure is shifted down by a single step in the next measure, so there's your A and A prime, and then it is followed by 2 more measures to complete the idea.
The B section.
Right. But Mozart, being an absolute structural show-off, doesn't just stop there.
Of course not.
He embeds an unexpected structural detail. He nests another entire sentence inside it.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The last 2 measures of that B section can actually be analyzed as their own miniature sentence. It's a fractal.
That is insane.
And in the final movement of that exact same sonata, which most people know as the famous Turkish rondo, he starts with a sentence again.
Okay.
But this time, the A prime motive isn't shifted down, it is thrust upward by a third, which creates a completely different, much more aggressive energy right out of the gate.
I have to stop you here, because when we start labeling music with letters and primes and talking about formulas like A prime, B, and nested fractals, I'm going to be completely honest, it starts to sound incredibly clinical.
It can, yeah.
It sounds like we're sitting in a geometry class doing a mathematical proof.
I get that a lot.
Does focusing on this math take away the emotion for the listener? Like, if I am sitting in the audience calculating interval shifts and looking for A prime, am I entirely missing the beauty of the art?
I completely understand that reaction. It's a very common fear that analyzing the magic somehow destroys the magic.
Right.
But the reality is quite the opposite. These mathematical blocks are exactly what create the narrative flow that causes the emotional reaction in the first place.
Okay, tell me more.
Think of it like a novelist using spoken language. If you focus on the fact that a written sentence has a subject, a verb, and a predicate, it doesn't make a beautiful poem any less heartbreaking, right?
That's true.
The grammatical structure explains why the poetry flows so well into your brain. In music, these mathematical sentences are how composers literally have a conversation with you. They build what we call phrases.
So we're zooming out slightly now,
Exactly.
from motives to sentences, and now sentences combine to make phrases. And this is described almost exactly like a literal question and answer session.
It is an acoustic conversation. To keep the flow of ideas moving forward while still maintaining a sense of unity, composers mimic the psychological structure of a statement and a response.
Right.
You have a first phrase, which in music theory is called the antecedent. Now, this antecedent phrase ends with a weak cadence.
What exactly makes a cadence weak? What am I actually hearing?
Well, a cadence is simply a starting point, a harmonic resting place at the very end of a phrase.
Like a punctuation mark.
Exactly. A weak cadence means the chords used don't feel entirely resolved. It doesn't feel final.
Okay.
If you were speaking, it acts like a comma or a question mark. The pitch often goes up, or it lands on a chord that feels unstable. It leaves you physically hanging, expecting more. Your brain just says, wait, that's not the end.
And then, to relieve that tension, comes the consequent phrase.
Yes. The consequent phrase is the answer to the question. It is related to the first phrase, perhaps using the exact same motives, but it ends with a strong, authentic cadence.
So it puts a period on it.
It lands firmly on the home key, the tonic. It puts a definitive, heavy period at the end of the musical thought. Your brain finally relaxes.
Oh.
When a composer uses this specific series of question and answer phrases, it's called periodic music. This is the fundamental mechanism of how you guide the human ear through long pieces of music, just like paragraphs and chapters guide a reader through a novel without them getting exhausted.
Okay, the architecture is totally making sense. We have our atoms, our motives, we string them together into these logical A prime B sentences, and we pair those sentences into question and answer periods.
You've got it.
But once you have a solid paragraph, how do you build a whole chapter?
That's the challenge.
Because you mentioned earlier that the human ear loves familiarity, but it absolutely despises boredom. If you just play the exact same perfectly constructed question and answer sentence over and over for 20 minutes, people are going to walk out of the concert hall.
Without a doubt.
Composers had to create larger macro structures that could balance that comforting repetition with the thrill of novelty.
Which brings us to a really crucial concept, the comfort of return. We are stepping up to the larger macro structures of binary and ternary forms.
Let's do it.
The simplest, most primal way to get at the listener something completely new without alienating them entirely is a two-part structure known as binary form.
Binary, meaning two. So this is essentially an A section and a B section.
Two parts, roughly equal in duration, distinguished by entirely different melodies, and divided by clear, undeniable cadences.
Okay.
Quite often, each part is repeated, giving us a literal A-A-B-B structure. The psychological rule here is that you repeat the A material to give the listener something familiar to latch onto.
To build their confidence.
Exactly, to build their confidence before you throw them into the deep end with the completely new B section.
Let's look at how a genius uses this rule, because Bach's famous air on the G string is a pristine example of this.
It really is.
On paper, it follows the binary rule flawlessly. You have your A section, it stops. And then you have a B section. But Bach introduces a brilliant, unexpected structural detail to completely trick your ear.
He is a master illusionist. Bach adheres to the structural rule of providing a B melody, but he makes that seemingly new B melody secretly relate to the A melody.
How does he do that?
He uses similar rhythmic fingerprints and melodic contours, meaning the shape of the notes going up and down. But to make sure your conscious brain registers it as a completely new section, he starts the B melody on a totally different, much lower pitch and uses entirely different underlying harmonies.
It is a total acoustic disguise.
Yes. He gives you the profound comfort of the A section dressed up in a masterful new outfit. It makes the B section feel entirely fresh and novel, while your subconscious remains deeply connected to the core material. You feel grounded even though you think you are in a totally new place.
That is just incredibly sneaky.
It is.
But it turns out, we actually like that familiar A material so much that Composers decided to evolve this binary idea into something called the rounded binary form.
Right.
This is ABA. You have your two distinct sections, but at the very end of that second section, you basically loop back and return to the starting A melody.
It provides immense closure. Usually that final A is a shortened version of the original, and Mozart loved playing with the expectations of this specific rule.
Like in his Piano Sonata K284.
Perfect example. The initial A section modulates, meaning it physically shifts its harmonic center into a totally new key.
I want to pause on modulates and key for a second. For someone who doesn't play an instrument, how should they visualize a key change?
Think of a key as a specific landscape, like a room you are standing in. The home key or tonic is your living room.
Okay, I'm in my living room.
It's safe, it's comfortable, gravity pulls straight down. Modulating to a new key is like opening a door and walking into a completely different room. The lighting is different, the acoustics are different. It feels subtly tense because you know you aren't in your home base anymore. So in Mozart's piece, the first A section takes you into a new room.
Okay.
But when that A section returns at the very end of the piece, Mozart breaks his own structural rule. Instead of modulating again and leaving you stranded in that second room, he rewrites the melody so it stays firmly locked in the original home key.
Oh, wow.
He gives you the familiar melody, but ensures you are safely back in your living room, providing an incredibly satisfying, grounded sense of finality.
So rounded binary is ABA. But there is another major form called ternary form, which is also ABA.
Yes, it is.
If they both have the exact same letters, what on earth is the difference?
The crucial distinction lies in the concept of independence. In a true ternary form, the three sections are completely independent, self-contained entities.
Whereas in rounded binary, they kind of bleed together.
Right, in rounded binary, the parts flow into each other. But in ternary, the B section is entirely cordoned off. It is usually in a totally new key, and it has a drastically different emotional feel.
Like?
Perhaps a massive change in volume, a different orchestration, or a completely new tempo. It stands entirely alone as its own complete musical thought, ending with a strong cadence before the A section ever returns.
There's a piece by the Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg from his lyric pieces. It's a track called Hjemve, which translates to homesickness.
Oh, a beautiful piece.
And this blew me away because it is a perfect illustration of how ternary form isn't just about organizing notes on a page. It is basically emotional manipulation disguised as a mathematical structure.
What's fascinating here is exactly how Grieg weaponizes the ABA structure to tell a profound psychological story. The piece begins with the A section, which is this incredibly haunting, melancholic melody set in E minor.
And minor keys always feel sadder.
Exactly. The minor key naturally feels darker, more subdued. It perfectly captures the aching pain of missing home. You physically feel the cold isolation.
Yeah.
Then the music comes to a complete, sustained pause. The door closes, and the structure shifts suddenly into the entirely independent B section.
And the B section is a completely different world.
9-day.
It's an E major. Suddenly it's fast, it's lively, the rhythm is literally dancing. It sounds exactly like a happy, warm memory of being back home with your friends, completely independent from the freezing sadness of the beginning.
Exactly. It has a bright new theme, a new major mode, and it ends with a very clear, conclusive, happy cadence in its own key.
So it's a joyful memory.
It is a joyful memory, but then the rigid rule of the ternary structure demands a return.
You have to go back to A.
The haunting E minor theme comes back as the second A. Now, structurally, if you look at the sheet music, the notes of this second A are completely 100% identical to the opening.
Not a single note changed.
Not one. But psychologically, for you as the listener sitting in that room, it feels entirely different.
Because you just experienced the immense joy of the B section.
Right.
The contrast is just brutal. The return of the sad melody feels so much more devastating because you were just reminded of what you lost.
Yes.
The rule of the form, that mandatory return to A, is exactly the mechanism that creates the emotional gut punch. The ink on the page hasn't changed at all, but you have changed because of the journey you went on in the middle.
That is the immense power of macrostructure. It dictates the emotional journey. But to be fair, not all ABA forms were designed for deep, introspective, psychological storytelling.
Wait, really?
Sometimes the structural rule of returning to the A section was designed for pure, unadulterated human ego.
Yes. Which brings us to the Baroque vocal form, the da capo aria.
The pop music of its day.
This was essentially the stadium pop music structure of the opera world in the 1700s. Da capo literally translates from Italian as from the head.
Right.
So the structure is super simple. You sing section A, you sing a contrasting section B, and at the bottom of the page, the sheet music literally just says da capo. Go back to the head, go back to the very beginning, and sing section A again until the end.
On the surface, it seems like a very strict, restrictive rule. The composer is demanding that you must repeat exactly what you already sang.
But the unwritten rule, the incredible, unexpected structural detail of this era, was that the singer was absolutely expected to wildly break the boundaries of the melody on that second pass.
Oh, it was mandatory.
If you just sang it the exact same way you sang it the first time, you would be laughed off the stage. You use that mandated repetition as an excuse to completely show off your vocal gymnastics.
It was an open invitation for extreme virtuosity. On the return to the A section, the performer would add massive improvisational embellishments.
Like what kind of stuff?
We are talking about insanely fast runs of notes, huge leaks across octaves that weren't written on the page, impossibly high sustained notes, and massive shifts in dynamics.
Wow.
The structural rule to repeat the A section existed almost solely to provide a baseline. It provided a familiar backdrop so the audience could fully appreciate how spectacularly the singer was playfully destroying the composer's original idea.
It's exactly like watching a routine in Olympic gymnastics.
That's a great analogy.
You do the mandatory elements first, so the judges know you can do them. And then on the second pass, you throw in the triple twisting backflips to get the crowd on their feet.
Exactly.
The da capo aria proves that showing off is actually a fantastic driver of musical innovation. People naturally want to push the limits of their physical abilities. And that desire leads us perfectly to look at forms that were explicitly designed from the ground up for composers, rather than singers, to flex their musical muscles.
We enter the intricate games of imitation and variation. The core problem for a composer is this. How do you take one simple theme, one basic musical idea, and stretch it to its absolute theoretical limits without breaking the listener's attention?
And the most obvious, straightforward answer is the variation form. A composer presents a simple, completely unadorned theme.
Very plain.
Sometimes there's a little harmonic introduction to set the stage, but the theme itself is stripped down and straightforward.
Yep.
Then they write anywhere from 3 to 30 variations on that exact same theme.
And the rules of variation are broad, but incredibly demanding of a composer's creativity. The composer must change something fundamental to keep it interesting, while ensuring the original DNA of the theme remains recognizable.
So they might take a happy major theme and plunge it into a dark minor key.
Exactly. Or they might add elaborate, dizzying trills and lightning-fast scales over the top of the slow melody. Or they might keep a specific figure, which is a distinct rhythmic or melodic pattern completely consistent throughout, while changing absolutely all the harmonies and textures around it.
Like Brahms.
Yes, this was a technique Johannes Brahms was famously obsessed with. The goal, the game, is that each variation sounds distinctly new but always evocative of the original theme. It's like looking at a single object through 30 different funhouse mirrors.
Then you have the rondo form, which takes a very different approach to the idea of repetition. Using our trusty letter system, a small rondo structure is ABACA.
Right.
A large rondo structure is ABACAPA.
The rondo actually has a fascinating historical lineage. It traces its roots back to a medieval vocal form known as a form fixe.
A fixed form.
Yes. In this medieval structure, the actual music itself would repeat rigidly, but the text the singers were delivering would always alternate, telling a progressing story.
Interesting.
By the time we reached the 18th century, this concept evolved into a purely instrumental form, where a highly catchy main theme, the A section, keeps returning over and over, separated by deeply contrasting episodes.
It is quite literally the blueprint for modern pop song.
It really is.
You have a really catchy chorus. You have verse 1, chorus, verse 2, chorus, bridge, chorus. It's built for creating instrumental hits.
Exactly.
Beethoven wrote a ridiculously fun piano piece called Rondo e Capriccio, but it is much better known by its nickname, Rage Over a Lost Penny.
Such a great piece.
And when you listen to it, the structure makes perfect sense of the title. The music goes on these wild, frantic tangents, like looking under the couch, tearing up the floorboards, but it just keeps obsessively spinning back to that frantic, looping main theme. The rule of the rondo perfectly captures the psychology of an obsessive search.
But if we really want to talk about strict, unforgiving rules and absolute mental gymnastics, we have to talk about the canon.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The word canon literally translates to rule. It is the absolute, strictest, most punishing form of imitation in all of music.
To visualize a basic canon, think of singing Row, Row, Row Your Boat in a round as a child.
For sure.
One person starts the melody, and a few beats later, the next person starts the exact same melody, imitating the first voice perfectly while the first voice continues. That is a basic, rudimentary canon.
Okay, pretty simple.
But master composers like J.S. Bach and the brilliant Renaissance polyphonist Josquin des Prez looked at that strict rule of imitation and found absolutely mind-bending ways to bend it to their will.
They created these unexpected structural details that sound like actual magic tricks. It defies logic. They would write a canon by augmentation.
Yes.
That means the second imitating voice plays the exact same melody as the first voice, but with the length of every single rhythm doubled. It's playing the melody in extreme slow motion, while the first voice plays it at normal speed simultaneously.
Or they would employ the opposite trick, canon by diminution, where the imitating voice plays the melody with the rhythms mathematically cut in half, racing through the theme twice as fast as the original voice.
Or canon by inversion, where they literally flip the entire melody upside down on the page.
Literally upside down.
If the first voice goes up a whole step, the imitating voice goes down a whole step. There are mirror images of each other playing at the exact same time.
And perhaps the most mathematically staggering, almost incomprehensible feat of all, the crab canon.
The crab canning.
In a crab canon, the imitating voice plays the primary melody completely backward, starting from the very last note and moving to the first, while the first voice plays it forward.
My brain hurts just thinking about that.
And somehow, through sheer architectural genius, Bach ensures that when these two voices are played simultaneously, one moving forward through time, one moving backward through time, the overlapping harmonies align perfectly, the dissonances resolve, and it sounds like a beautiful, cohesive piece of music.
That is just, it's showing off on a cosmological level.
Yeah.
It's like writing a novel that tells a beautiful story forward and tells an equally beautiful, cohesive story when you read the words backward.
It's astounding.
It's taking the strictest rule imaginable, perfect mathematical imitation, and proving that your mastery of the rules is so absolute that you can run the physics of the music backward and upside down and still create profound art.
And this intense obsession with balancing strict rules and creative freedom peaked in the Renaissance and Baroque eras with the invention of the fugue.
The fugue.
The term itself comes from the Latin word fuga, meaning flight or fleeing. A fugue requires 3 or more independent voices, whether real human singers or separate instrumental lines imitating each other.
Like a much more complex round.
Exactly. They enter one after another with the exact same subject, and then they weave together into incredibly complex, intertwining polyphony. It was considered the absolute pinnacle of human achievement in balancing strict mathematical compositional rules with ultimate creative freedom.
Yeah. Okay. So we spent a lot of time looking at how rules govern the smaller sections. We see how they govern a single melody being imitated backward in a canon, or how they structure an ABA song.
We've stayed pretty zoomed in.
Right. But as history progressed, music didn't stay small. Eventually, composers wanted to write massive, hour-long epics utilizing massive symphony orchestras with dozens of different instruments.
The scale exploded.
How on earth did they organize these huge multi-movement architectures without the audience and, frankly, the musicians themselves getting completely lost in the noise?
You need macro structures. If you are building a skyscraper, you can't just use the blueprints for a shed.
That's a good point.
You need architectural foundations that everyone intuitively understands without having to actively think about them. And sometimes those blueprints are incredibly rigid by design, like the march.
When I think of a march, I honestly just think of loud brass, pounding snare drums, and keeping time.
Yeah.
Left, right, left, right. It seems so simple.
It does seem simple.
But the march actually has an incredibly strict, standardized structural form, largely codified by band composers like John Philip Sousa and Henry Fillmore.
The rules of the march are surprisingly specific and unforgiving. A march is divided into distinct sections called strains.
Strains, okay.
The unexpected structural detail is how heavily governed these strains are. There is always a final strain called a trio, and it is practically an unshakable structural law that this trio section must modulate to a specific new key, exactly a perfect fifth below the original key of the march.
Hold on, back up. A perfect fifth below. What does it actually mean to my ear? Why that specific interval?
It's all about acoustic gravity. Moving down a perfect fifth fundamentally shifts the tension in the music. It relaxes the harmonic energy.
How so?
After the loud, bombastic opening strains of a march, dropping down a fifth for the trio section clears the air. It thins the texture, usually dropping in volume, which provides the listener with a necessary psychological breather.
Ah, so it's a palate cleanser.
Exactly. It creates a temporary lull so that the composer has room to build the momentum back up for the grand finale.
And there are even strict instrumentation rules built into the form. It is almost mandated that the trombones will be given the booming main melody during the second strain.
Oh, trombones always get that melody.
And when these strains repeat, the rules dictate that new, highly decorative counter-melodies, which are called obligatos, are layered on top of the original melody to build that momentum you mentioned.
It's an incredibly rigid box. The composer has very few options, but it perfectly serves its singular function, creating forward momentum and relentless energy.
But if we were talking about grand architecture, the most important macro structure in the entire history of classical music is undoubtedly the sonata form.
Oh, without a doubt.
This is the structural blueprint that completely dominated the classical and romantic eras. It is essentially our old friend, the rounded binary form ABA, put on heavy steroids and expanded to epic proportions.
The sonata form has three massive, distinct pillars: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation.
It goes down for us.
The rules for the exposition are crystal clear. The composer must present their main themes. Usually there are two contrasting themes, and they must present them in two different keys.
Okay, two themes, two keys.
Typically, the primary theme is in the home key, the tonic. The secondary theme modulates to a related key, very often the dominant key. This establishes a fundamental harmonic tension right at the start.
I would try to picture what the dominant key tension feels like.
Think of the tonic home key as standing flat on your feet on the floor. It's solid, you're balanced.
Okay.
The dominant key is like standing up on your tiptoes. You can hold that position for a while and it elevates you, but it builds tension in your calves.
You start to wobble.
Eventually, gravity, or the natural acoustics of the harmony, demands that you drop your heels back down to the floor. The exposition leaves you standing on your tiptoes. Then comes the development section.
And the development is where the rules essentially allow for absolute terrifying chaos.
It is where the familiar themes from the exposition are violently torn apart. They are fragmented into those tiny motives we discussed earlier. They are placed in entirely new contexts, thrown into unexpected, distant keys, and given totally new orchestrations.
It sounds chaotic.
It is musically disorienting. It represents struggle, conflict, and immense tension.
I always think of sonata form as the ultimate musical manifestation of the hero's journey. Think about any great story or a movie. In the exposition, you leave your safe village, you are introduced to the characters, and you travel to a new, unfamiliar place that's the shift to the second key.
That's a great way to think of it.
Then, in the development, you face the dragon. You face trials. You get broken down, confused, fragmented. The musical themes are literally battling each other, constantly shifting keys so you never feel safe.
And then, after the battle, comes the recapitulation, the glorious return home.
Right. The themes from the beginning return, usually in their original order.
Yeah.
But here is the critical, non-negotiable structural rule of the recapitulation. All the themes, even the secondary theme that was in a different key during the exposition, must now be played in the original home key, the tonic.
That's the secret sauce.
You have returned to your village, but because you went through the trials of the development section, the world is now unified. The tension is finally resolved. Both themes now live together peacefully in the exact same key. You can finally drop off your tiptoes and stand flat on the floor.
It is an incredibly satisfying, perfectly designed psychological journey.
And that journey might take up an entire 15 or 20-minute first movement of a symphony.
Yeah.
But that presents a totally new architectural problem. What happens when a symphony has 4 of 5 completely different movements? You have a sonata, a slow movement, a dance, a finale. How do you unify a 45-minute experience so the listener doesn't feel like they just listened to 4 random pieces of music strung together?
Composers utilized what is called cyclic form.
Cyclic form is brilliant. It's exactly like planting an Easter egg across an entire movie franchise. It involves embedding a single recurring musical idea or motive across all the completely different movements of a larger work.
And this idea has deep, deep historical roots. Back in the Renaissance, composers would write an entire mass with multiple distinct sections like the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, and they would use a single pre-existing plain song chant as the hidden foundation for every single movement.
Just burying it in the music.
Exactly. They might hide it in the tenor line or stretch it out so slowly you barely consciously register it. In the Baroque era, dance suites would sometimes take the exact same core melody and disguise it in different tempos and rhythms for each individual dance.
So you don't even know you're hearing it.
Right. It creates an invisible, subconscious thread that ties the massive architecture together. It makes the listener instinctively feel that all these disparate movements belong to a single, unified, inevitable whole.
So the sonata form and these grand cyclic architectures dominated for centuries.
Yeah.
Composers mastered these boxes. They knew exactly how to manipulate the tension and release.
They had it down to a science.
But as we move out of the classical era and deep into the late Romantic era of the late 19th century, things start to fundamentally change. Composers began to feel a little claustrophobic inside these perfect, symmetrical boxes.
They really did.
They wanted to express more complex, turbulent, darker human emotions, and the old rules of always return to the home key felt too restrictive, too neat and tidy for the modern world.
Which brings us to an era characterized by bending and stretching the rules to their absolute structural limits. We see the rise of forms that prioritize organic, continuous growth over rigid mathematical symmetry.
Okay, like what?
One fascinating modern analytical concept used to explain how these late composers operated is called rotational form.
Rotational form. This is a concept formulated by modern music analysts Warren Darcy and James Hippokowski. They applied it to the incredibly dense, sprawling late Romantic works of composers like Richard Wagner, Gustav Mahler, and Jean Sibelius.
If the sonata form is a box with clear compartments, exposition, development, recapitulation, rotational form is a spiral.
A spiral.
Instead of a rigid ABA structure, the composer creates a sequence of themes or motives. Let's say they present themes 1, 2, and 3. They play through that sequence. That is one complete rotation. Then they immediately go back to the beginning and play through the cycle again.
But the unexpected detail, the genius of it, is that they don't just repeat it identically like a da capo aria.
No, not at all.
With each new rotation, the themes organically develop, expand, and reveal more of themselves. It's a combination of the comfort of repetition and the thrill of continuous development.
It is incredibly difficult to pull off without totally boring the audience. In the first movement of Mahler's Sixth Symphony, or Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, you can hear these massive rotations overlaying traditional forms.
Right.
But the most staggering, monumental example is in Act 2 of Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal. Wagner creates a complex series of 4 interrelated motives, and he doesn't just cycle through them once or twice.
How many times does he do it?
It takes 12 massive, slow iterations, 12 full, spiraling rotations before those motives reach their ultimate, full, shattering realization.
I'm trying to picture sitting through that. It must be like watching a flower open in a macro time-lapse video. You see the exact same petals in every single frame, but with every passing second, it expands and shifts slightly until it finally reaches full bloom.
That's exactly what it feels like.
It's a much more natural, organic way of developing music, but it requires a composer with immense, almost terrifying control, so the audience doesn't just feel like they're trapped in a musical roundabout going in circles.
Exactly. And alongside these massive, spiraling, highly controlled architectures, the Romantic era also saw a deep, burning desire for the exact opposite. Spontaneous, unbridled energy.
They wanted to break free.
Composers wanted their meticulously written, heavily practiced music to sound to the audience like it was being completely made up on the spot.
They wanted to capture lightning in a bottle. We are talking about improvisatory forms, things titled fantasias, impromptus, and intermezzi.
Now, the desire to capture the reckless abandonment of improvisation isn't entirely new to the Romantics. In the Baroque era, Bach wrote his chromatic fantasia and fugue, which famously alternates between lightning-fast technical displays and slower, lyrical, almost wandering sections without any strict formal boundaries.
No.
Mozart wrote his fantasia in C minor in 4 sections of wildly varying tempos, completely abandoning the normal expected key relationships of his highly structured era.
But in the Romantic era, composers like Frédéric Chopin and Franz did something fascinating. They created a structural paradox. The hybrid form.
Hybrid form.
They wanted the wild, rule-breaking, passionate spontaneity of an improvisation. But they also wanted the epic, towering scope and gravitas of a sonata or a large-scale binary form. They didn't want to just write a loose doodle. They wanted a masterpiece that sounded like a doodle.
So they forcefully wedded the two concepts. In pieces like Chopin's Fantasy in F minor or Liszt's Impromptu in F sharp, the phrase lengths and tempos shift unpredictably. The music stops and starts. It feels entirely spontaneous and emotionally volatile on the surface.
Sounds chaotic.
But if you analyze the sheet music underneath, The larger key relationships and the overarching thematic designs strictly follow historic macro-architectural plans.
It's an illusion.
They built a roller coaster that feels completely out of control flying off the tracks, but is actually bolted flawlessly to a massive hidden steel frame.
The Romantics bent the rules of tonality, they stretched the structural boxes into spirals, and they pushed human emotion to the absolute bleeding edge. But eventually you stretch a rubber band so far that it doesn't just bend anymore.
It snaps.
It snaps. And that profound snap leads us directly into the 20th century, the era of rebellion, the absolute destruction of the rules.
It was a revolution.
For hundreds of years, Western music was entirely defined by tonality. The idea we discussed earlier that there's a home key, a tonic, a floor to stand on, and that chords move with a sense of tension and release, like gravity, always pulling you back to that home base.
Right.
But at the dawn of the 20th century, composers looked at the world around them, a world entering the industrial age and eventually global war, and they decided to bung that musical map completely.
The most famous instigator of this rebellion was Arnold Schoenberg. We mentioned his early work with classical forms, but his later evolution is where he broke history.
What did you do?
Early in his career, he wrote a piece called Verklärte Nacht, Transfigured Night. He submitted it to the prestigious Vienna Music Society for performance, and they outright rejected it.
They just said no.
Why? Because Schoenberg had invented a chord, a specific combination of notes that, according to the strict, sacred textbooks of music theory at the time, quote-unquote, did not exist.
I love Schoenberg's reaction to this. It is legendary. He basically scoffed and said, well, the work cannot be performed since one cannot perform that which does not exist.
It's brilliant.
He was highlighting the absolute absurdity of letting theoretical academic rules dictate what sounds a human being is allowed to imagine and create. It's like telling a painter they aren't allowed to mix blue and yellow because the resulting color isn't in the official dictionary.
It was pure audacity. And while Schoenberg was pushing harmony into new, highly dissonant, uncomfortable territory in Germany and Austria, the French composers were taking a very different, much more ethereal approach to escaping the rigid rules of tonality.
The French went a different route.
Composers like Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel started utilizing what is called the whole tone scale.
To understand why the whole tone scale is such a massive rebellion, you have to really understand the layout of a piano keyboard. Traditional Western scales, the ones that build sonatas and symphonies, are made of an uneven mixture of whole steps and half steps.
Right.
Those half steps, the notes right next to each other, like a white key and the black key immediately touching it, are what create all the musical tension. They are the acoustic gravity that pulls a melody toward a resolution. They are what make you want to drop off your tiptoes.
But a whole tone scale completely removes the half steps. Every single note in the scale is exactly one whole step apart from the next. It is perfectly, mathematically symmetrical.
The unexpected structural detail of removing those tiny half steps is that you completely remove the structural tension that defined Western music for hundreds of years. The music completely loses its gravity.
It just floats.
It doesn't need to resolve anywhere because there is no home key pulling at it. Every note is equally distant from the next.
It creates a very specific, almost sensuous, dreamlike atmosphere. It is beautiful, but it lacks momentum. Because it lacks that fundamental tension and release, the sound of the whole tone scale actually quickly became commercialized and overused.
Oh, totally.
By the 1950s, Hollywood film composers were using it as a massive cliché. It became the default, easy sound for a mysterious passage of time, a dream sequence, or the sound of someone descending into oblivion in a movie. It felt weirdly faceless and ambiguous because it entirely lacked the identifying markers and gravity of traditional tonality.
So the French are floating away in these dreamlike, gravityless whole tone scales, and Schoenberg is pushing into an increasingly harsh dissonance. But Schoenberg wasn't satisfied with just breaking the old rules of tonality.
I got it all.
He didn't want to just float. He wanted to replace the old rules. And this is where the history of music gets truly wild. He didn't just advocate for pure, anarchic chaos. He created a new, terrifyingly strict totalitarian rulebook.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Schoenberg recognized a fundamental problem. Without the acoustic gravity of tonality to hold a piece together, large-scale musical structures could easily fall apart into random, incomprehensible noise.
Right.
A symphony would just sound like instruments falling down a flight of stairs. So to solve this, he developed total serialism, specifically the 12-tone system. He created a mathematical method that guaranteed complete structural atonality.
Here's the ultimate unbreakable rule of the 12-tone system. The composer takes all 12 notes of the chromatic scale, literally every single key, black and white, within an octave on the piano and arranges them in a preset order.
A very specific order.
This is called the tone row. The composer can choose any order they want for their row. But once that row is set, the ironclad rule is that no single note can be repeated until all 11 other notes have been played.
It is total chromaticism, but it is totally mathematically controlled. There is no home key. No note is more important than any other note. And the composer builds the entire piece, chords, melodies, bass lines, strictly out of variations of this single row.
Just manipulating that one row.
They can play the row backward, which is called retrograde. They can flip it upside down in inversion. They can stack the notes to play them as chords. But the math must always, always be respected. The sequence of intervals dictates absolutely everything that happens in the piece.
Wait, I have to jump in here. You are telling me Schoenberg was so mad about the restrictive rules of classical music that he invented a system where I literally cannot play a C note again until I've played every single other key on the piano.
That is exactly what I'm telling you.
That doesn't sound like creative freedom. That sounds like a musical prison. It sounds infinitely more restrictive than a sonata.
It is a paradox, isn't it?
Oh.
Schoenberg believed that by enforcing this absolute equality of all 12 notes, he was freeing music from the tyranny of the tonic, the home key. But you are right. The 12-tone system replaced one set of rules with a set of mathematical constraints so rigid they dictate every single note choice. It requires intense, obsessive control. But of course, the 20th century is nothing if not a study in wild extremes.
Yeah, we swung the pendulum pretty hard.
If Schoenberg represents absolute, obsessive mathematical control, the polar opposite reaction to the death of tonality was the embrace of zero control.
The complete abandonment of traditional notation, rules, and even intentionality entirely. We have composers literally throwing the rulebook out the window and letting chaos reign.
We see the rise of what is known as aleatoric or chance music.
There are accounts of the toothbrush splatter method. A composer would literally dip a toothbrush in ink and flick it onto the staff paper, letting the random chance of the splatter dictate what notes the musicians will play.
Pure chance.
They surrender their structural authority entirely to physics and gravity.
Or, perhaps the most famous and most controversial example of musical zero control in the 20th century. The avant-garde composer John Cage's piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds.
4 minutes and 33 seconds.
The only rule in this entire composition is a strict time limit. The score instructs the performer, very often a pianist, to walk out onto the stage, sit at their instrument, start a stopwatch, and make zero intentional sound for exactly 4 minutes and 33 seconds. They sit in complete silence.
The first time I heard about this, I thought it was a joke, an insult to the audience. But the unexpected structural detail is that the music isn't coming from the stage at all. The music is the ambient noise of the room. Take 3 seconds right now, wherever you're listening to this. Don't pause it. Just listen to the background of your room.
Just listen.
You just heard the hum of your fridge, maybe a car outside, the wind, your own breathing. John Cage's insight was that true silence doesn't actually exist for human beings.
It really doesn't.
By putting a rigid frame of 4 minutes and 33 seconds around that ambient noise, by applying a strict structural rule of time, he forces your brain to start organizing that random noise as if it were a composition. He was proving that music is just whatever sounds you decide to pay attention to.
It totally shifts the perspective.
So what does this all mean? If we look at this entire spectrum we've covered today, if we range from Schoenberg's obsessive, totalitarian mathematical control where every single note is serialized, all the way to a composer flicking ink off a toothbrush or sitting in absolute silence for 4 minutes, is it actually still music?
That is the ultimate defining question of contemporary music, and the brilliant part is it forces the listener to be an active participant rather than a passive consumer. Contemporary music doesn't hand you a comforting ABA structure on a silver platter to make you feel safe. It forces you to decide what structure actually means to you. Is music the acoustic sound itself vibrating in the air, or is it the human intention behind the organization of that sound? Is it the math or the silence? The choice and the challenge is entirely up to the listener.
We have been on quite a monumental journey today. We started at the absolute microscopic level, looking at how Mozart and Beethoven used tiny musical atoms, these fragments of sound, to build logical sentences and question and answer periods.
We really covered a lot of ground.
We saw how the Baroque superstars used the repeating rules of the Da Capoeira as an excuse to show off their rule-breaking vocal pyrotechnics, feeding their own egos while advancing the art form.
We examined the grand, sweeping architectures of the sonata form, charting the psychological hero's journey of tension and release through the exposition, development, and recapitulation. And we watched the late Romantics stretch and spiral those exact same forms into massive rotational cycles, trying desperately to capture the wild energy of spontaneous improvisation while keeping the steel frame intact.
Before finally witnessing the explosive 20th century rebellion, where the very foundations of musical gravity tonality itself were entirely abolished, leading us into a world fractured between absolute mathematical control and absolute chaotic silence.
Quite the journey.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, there's one final, incredibly provocative thought about how we, as human beings, perceive all of this structure. It relies on a concept called implied harmony.
Implied harmony is a fascinating psychological and acoustic phenomenon. The easiest way to grasp it is to compare it to a visual internet meme you've likely seen floating around.
Oh, the reading one.
Yes, it's a paragraph of text where all the vowels have been completely removed, or the letters in the middle of the words are entirely jumbled, but the first and last letters of the words are correct.
Right. And despite the fact that the actual literal structure of the words is broken, missing, or chaotic, your brain reads the paragraph perfectly fluently. You don't even stumble. Your mind sees the outline and just fixes it in real time.
The exact same principle applies to listening to music. In a fast-paced piece of music, a composer might only play a few scattered notes of a complex chord as the melody flies by. The complete acoustic structure of the chord isn't actually there in the physical airwaves,
Right.
but your mind supplies the rest. Your brain hears the outline, remembers the context, and subconsciously fills in the missing harmony to make the structure complete. You hear things that are not physically there.
That is wild.
This raises an important question. If our brains are that incredibly powerful, if we naturally seek out, predict, and fill in these complex structural gaps entirely on our own, are the rules of musical form actually written by the composers on the page?
Oh, why?
Or did composers just slowly, over centuries of trial and error, discover the rules that are already hardwired into the human brain? Are sonata forms and ternary forms, and even the tension of a dominant chord, just reflections of how our minds are biologically programmed to organize the chaos of the world into something meaningful?
It strongly suggests that the painted lines on the basketball court aren't just arbitrary boundaries drawn by an official. They are drawn exactly where our human psychology demands they be drawn to make the game satisfying to watch.
Exactly.
And the unexpected slam dunks, the broken rules, the surprise modulations, and the genius variations, they only thrill us because our brains are constantly, desperately trying to predict the future. And we absolutely love the feeling of being brilliantly outsmarted by a master.
It's all about expectations.
It is something profound for you to ponder and listen for the next time you put on your headphones. When you hear that tension resolve or that returning melody, ask yourself, are you hearing the music, or are you just hearing your own mind organizing the sound? We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of music. Keep listening, keep questioning the rules, and we will see you next time.